Hello, everyone. Brainerd Carey here. And today we're talking about critics, reaching out to critics. So I want to first thank you all for being members of this group. It's wonderful to have you guys in this group. You've been really supportive of each other, great questions in here. And lately, you guys have been also posting more topics for me to talk on, which I address in these Friday talks. So again, if any of you have any topics you want discussed, post them right now in this thread. I'd love to hear from you about other topics or things that you want to see addressed here. So welcome everybody to this live talk. Welcome here. I'm going to answer questions at the end of this. This won't be too long, so I'll get to your questions pretty soon. So to begin with, we're talking about critics today. How to, etiquette of reaching out to them, how to get to them, different ways of approaching them. And I'm going to talk about some pretty straightforward things that's not so different from the ways of approaching curators. But to begin with, critics, right? We're talking about people who write reviews in magazines, people who have blogs and write reviews. How do we reach them? How do we get them to write about your work and be responsive and have a dialogue with them? So to begin with, just to talk about like what does a critic do and how do they get paid and who do they work for? Because there's different types of critics, right? There's a critic like Jerry Saltz who works for New York Magazine and he's on salary for New York Magazine. He has a Twitter feed and Facebook, but he's on salary at a magazine, much like his wife Roberta Smith, who's on salary for the New York Times, and that's their income. That's how they get paid. They're not getting paid a terrific income as incomes go. Jerry is one of the few critics that bemoans his income all the time because it's difficult for him to continue to afford his apartment in New York. But or maybe that's just how he's trying to connect to his user base a little bit. But essentially, critics is what I'm saying. There's either independent critics who have blogs who are just writing about different kinds of things. There's one called The Jealous Curator, a kind of well-known blog, but there's lots of them, right? And there's also a place like Hyperallergic where there's a number of writers that are writing for that blog, right? As well as the Brooklyn Rail and plenty of other magazines and online things. But taking Hyperallergic, for example, there are critics that are writing reviews of shows. That's what they do. They write reviews of shows. They choose what shows they want to write about. Often the editor tells them which shows to write about, and they pursue those shows. So there's three kinds of critics I'm talking about here. There's one, like Jerry Saltz, Peter Stedel, and many others who are on salary from a magazine. And then there are ones who are not on salary, but they're getting paid by the article from a place like Hyperallergic. And those are individual writers. They change all the time, and often their directions come from editors. And then there's ones that have independent blogs, and they're just trying to build their own name as a critic to get the attention of other people. And they also are kind of writing their own world, and perhaps their blog will attract advertising one day. There's one, Art F City, that's by Patty Johnson, another blog that's kind of like Hyperallergic that's writes about shows. So again, there's staff writers, there's freelance writers, and then there's individual bloggers, right? There are the three different types of critics. So in terms of reaching out to the critic, etiquette of reaching out to them, I'll just start off with the don'ts. The etiquette of the do's and don'ts. The don'ts are just saying, here's my show, come see it, and you give them a link to the show. Or I'd love you to review my show, here it is. Or please check out my website, here it is. Something like that is definitely a no-no. And the reason it is because it's not the warmest introduction to say, check out what I'm doing. And the reason I mentioned kind of like their salaries and what they're doing is most of these critics are struggling to make a living. It's not easy to necessarily make a living, and though we may view them as these powerful people who have the ability to help careers enormously, they see themselves as people who are just writing about art. Jerry Saltz, in particular, has said that people often tell him, "God, if you just wrote about my work, I'd be doing great." And he said, "I've trashed artists and written terrible reviews of artists that went on to have great acclaim, and I have also written glowing reviews of young artists who ended up going nowhere." So he was kind of downplaying the power of the critic, and I'm downplaying the power of the critic a little bit here, and just kind of giving some perspective. Of course, we want reviews, and that's what this is about. So how do you reach them? What's the do's, the right way, though, the good etiquette to reach them? And it's quite simple, really. It's to engage them in a conversation. So whether you're looking at a critic like Jerry Saltz, who in some ways isn't so consequential because he's writing specific reviews for the New York Magazine, but he's got an incredible active following on Twitter as well as Facebook. And what I would suggest to reach critics in terms of the right etiquette is to engage them in a conversation. You know, if you even look at what, some of the feeds that he has, Jerry Saltz, he makes a comment, he says something a little inflammatory often. He's kind of a pro at getting everybody talking about some issues. Like he says things like, "Oh, look at that, horrible thing that happened at an auction, all the money spent. Those people don't know anything about art." And he gets a lot of responses. So the way to engage someone like him, or John Yao, or many other critics out there, as well as all the writers on Hyperallergic, which are probably better shot to go for, because these are independent writers, as well as bloggers are independent writers, and they can often either choose to write for their publication, suggest something to the editor has final say, or they might be able to write about it in their own blog. What you can do is start engaging them in conversation. That's the big takeaway from this talk, this live talk here, is engaging critics in a conversation. So when you see someone write a review of a show in the Brooklyn Rail, or in online, or in Hyperallergic, or on an independent blog, and you can look at local ones that you follow in whatever state or country you're in, respond to that. And instead of responding critically, like, "I didn't like that show," respond to their writing and say things like, "I really love the way you wrote about this. It makes me want to ask you a question about this. Why did you say X or Y?" Engage them, not just a compliment, but engage them, because critics are used to two things. They're used to either kind of thumbs down or thumbs up on their reviews, or people kind of trashing what they say, like, that's not accurate, or kind of being combative. But really, they're sensitive individuals, just like all of us. They get hurt by criticism, they get lifted by compliments, and they get excited by engagement. So when you begin to engage them in a conversation and talk about something that is exciting you about what they say, they notice you immediately. And for those who are on Instagram too, works the same way there. Most comments are very minimal and they say very little. If you take just a little bit of energy to kind of address some of their ideas, their interests, they'll be so grateful and they'll respond to you. I often write to writers. I read the book review every week from the Times. It's one of my favorite sections. I think the writing in there is great, and I'm always looking for new books to read. And just the other week, I was amazed. There was a writer that was writing about animals, and it was the cover story on the book review, reviewing another book, but kind of really brilliant animal rights activist that was writing about other things. And she talked in the end very enigmatically about a kind of hug she got from an octopus. And I thought, like, what is that? And And I wrote to her. I just looked her up, found her email, and I noticed that she was an enormously active speaker and writer. She's written many books and super active on the kind of scene of animal rights, kind of like Jane Goodall, but it wasn't Jane Goodall. And I wrote her an email. I said, listen, that last paragraph was so enigmatic. It was such a fascinating article. It was a review she was writing for a book. And I said, I'd love to know what that was, that octopus hug. She wrote back to me. I was kind of amazed. I mean, here's a very well-known person who's super busy, who's getting commissioned for things like the New York Times book review. And she writes back. And that's because I asked her a question that, her article asked. Her article was kind of leaving you in a kind of limbo, in a kind of wowing limbo. And I wanted that resolved. So, to me, that was kind of amazing that someone like that even would write back. And if someone like that would write back, it's pretty easy to get other people to write back. And email is one way of doing it. I couldn't find a Twitter account for her. Otherwise, I would have done it there. But I've also talked to people on Twitter, well-known artists and critics, say something genuine, sensitive, ask about their work, and they will immediately not only respond in most cases if you're asking an engaging question, and if they don't, ask another one. Keep following them. Watch what they're doing. If you're interested in them, you'll want to do that anyway. But they'll not only think, wow, that's interesting, and respond, but if you're on social media, like Instagram, they'll click your profile right away to see what they think of you. It's human nature. We want to return the compliment when someone says, gosh, you're such a nice person. I really like you. We kind of want to think that they're a nice person too, and explore that a little more, because if a really nice person says we're nice, well, then the compliment means that much more, right? So, okay, I'm going to take questions in a second, but that's essentially it. Whether you were talking about three types of critics today. There's staff critics, like Jerry Saltz, like other major critics who are writing for places like the New York Times or New York Magazine or other major publications. And then there are independent critics who have their own blog, and that's largely what they do, just write on their own blog. Patty Johnson is one who does Art F City, but there are others like The Jealous Curator and different ones. And then there is independent staff writers for places like Hyperallergic. I'm just summing up this talk now. And Hyperallergic is a well-known art magazine, online only, and you can comment and reach out to those critics. And those critics in Hyperallergic are writing usually on the direction of the editor, and they're always changing, but those are art critics there. So if these art critics are in your neighborhood, if you're in New York, or you're not in New York, you want to write to the critics that are actually reviewing things near you. And again, in summary, the way you engage them is ideally on social media, by engaging them in a conversation, by addressing what they're talking about, what they're writing, but not just in a compliment. Address it in terms of asking them another question to engage them. That's really the idea. That will make them immediately click on your profile if it's Instagram or Twitter, and they'll see a little bit who you are right away. They'll see it in your little bio, and if you have a link to your website, they may even go there. That's how you get them to go there without even saying anything. You're getting critics to go there. But more important, the critics are thinking, you're nice, you're interesting, you're curious, you're the kind of person they want to hear from more. So the feeling will be mutual. Okay, so that's my talk. Let's see what's happening here. Clyde, Kip, great to have you aboard. Savas, Martin, Renee. Hey, everybody. And Bill, Shanna, Antonia, Luna, everybody's here. Great to have you all aboard. So I don't see any other questions right now, but please ask in this thread. I will answer them. I'd love to hear your experience in doing this. It would be great to hear more from any of you also in this thread on other topics for talks that you want to see happen. One's coming up about getting your work into a museum, and there's other talks coming up that are based on your suggestions. So yeah, if there's Martin, Great. Martin saying he wants to reinforce what I'm saying. He's done exactly as he suggested and gotten attention as a result. Currently waiting for an editor to approve an interview with me because I emailed the writer about some of her other interviews. We found lots of common ground. Also trading book recommendations with another critic. Yeah, really, really great to hear, Martin. So everybody just read what Martin said. Yeah, it's how social media works, and I'm so glad to hear that, Martin. That's great to hear. Keep repeating the process. You're obviously doing it the right way, and for everyone else, yeah, that's the way to do it. As what I was saying, and as Martin is testing to hear, it worked for him. So so again, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Martin, for that comment. So Clyde, where do you find critics? The place to find critics is really in your area. Wherever you're living, look at who's reviewing artwork. There could be local blogs, there could be local magazines. Who reviews art in your area? So the place to look for that is any publication that covers your city, your town. That would be where the critics are, because if you want them to review your work, your book, or anything like that, that's where that would take place. So critics to find wherever you are in the world, look at critics who are within your geographical area, and that would be either from blogs about art that cover your geographical area, local publications, even local newspapers usually have a critic or someone on there that is involved in criticism, or any other media in your local area. Liz says, yeah, it's like showing up to meetings and openings, I guess. Engage people and let them know you're around. Yeah, it is like showing up to meetings. That is true. Engage people. With critics, though, and since so much of it is online, you're exactly right, Liz, it's also about being very specific and appealing to their kind of intellectual curiosity and what they're looking for, what they're interested in. Not so much what they're looking for, but what they're already interested in. If you can engage them with that, yeah, you get everywhere. It's great flattery. Who should be approached, Bill says, to write a foreword for a catalog? Well, that's a good question. To write a foreword for a catalog, you can ask a critic. And those are usually paid gigs. What do they get? Between $500 and $1,500. The top critic, $1,500 for a 500 to 1,000 word essay for a foreword. Critics just starting out, you could probably get it for much less, or a trade or something. But in terms of, yeah, who to approach, you could approach any local critic. You could approach larger critics, regional critics, national critics. They're all busy, but their salary is not so great that they couldn't use an extra 500 or more to write an essay. And writers tend to get paid very little these days, between 10 and 20 cents a word. So that's not that much. Writers for Hyperallergic and other publications are not getting paid very much. So to give a writer a gig to write for a critic, a gig to write a foreword for a catalog is a good gig for them. And a lot of them support themselves that way. So you can reach out that way. Good question, Bill, Liz, and Luna. Yes, I agree, Luna. So glad to hear. Thank you. Karen said, I had the chance to talk to Jerry Saltz in an opening. I made him questions. He was so happy to talk. After he asked to see my work on Instagram, and we talked about it, but that was all. How to continue the contact. Okay, so she talked to someone, Jerry Saltz, and they followed up. The way to continue that contact with him is you could see him again at openings if you go to more openings, but also continue to dialogue with him. Again, Jerry, he can be very generous when he's in person, but also he is on assignment from New York Magazine. So he usually has very specific things that he has to write about. But if you want to keep in touch with him, Twitter seems like where he's very active. Write to him through Twitter. You could probably even direct message him there. But say things that he reads all those comments. So you can say things that are very specific. Continue to engage him there. I think he's also on Instagram, and you could possibly engage him there. I don't know if he's on Instagram, but I think he is. So Karen, I would just continue to dialogue with him, stay on his radar. That's how a lot of artists kind of continue to be in dialogue with him. Let's see. Okay, everyone. Thank you again for being here. Thank you for being members of this wonderful, supportive tribe. It's a pleasure to have you guys here, and I want to thank you for all the encouragement you give to each other, and for the great stories you post about your own success and struggles and questions. So, so I wish you all the best, the very best, and have a great time in your studio, and wherever you are in the world, a time of day. Have a great day or evening.